Hi, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Dragon Con. We are the alternate and historical fiction track, and we are so happy to have you with us for our panel focused on the suffrage movement. This is the 100th anniversary, and we really wanted a chance to not just celebrate all of the accomplishments and what it meant for our society, but to also honestly embrace the truth, which is that the suffrage movement started with very lofty goals and was so incredibly ambitious. And the reality is that they got bogged down by the times and failed to include the people in society that they ought to have been helping, including African American voices of other minorities. And we're hoping that in this hour that you guys will learn so much more about the suffrage movement than you ever learned in your history class. I'm going to start by introducing some of our fantastic people, beginning with Dr. Melissa Walker. Ms. Walker, if you would please introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, my name is Melissa Walker. I live in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I am the Emerita George Dean Johnson Professor of History at Converse College, where I focused a lot on women's and Southern history.
And we're also joined today with Dr. Omi Richardson. If you would please introduce yourself and what you're bringing to the panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Omi Richardson. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I am an assistant professor at Spelman College of Education and African Diaspora Studies.
Thank you so much. And another local personality, we have Jan Hebbard here. If you would please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jan Hebbard. I'm the exhibition coordinator at the Harvard Rare-Open Manuscript Library, which is part of the Special Collections Libraries at the University of Georgia.
And finally, joining us is Leanna Renee Hebbard with not just a great viewpoint on the time period, but also, I believe, a new novel.
Yes, indeed. Hello, I'm Leanna Renee Hieber, and I am a novelist, also an actress, as well as a playwright and a ghost tour guide. So I write a lot about women who were involving the paranormal as a way to sort of change history for the better. And that actually does have some real life applications like I'll be discussing. But here's my latest book because I can't help but show off my latest baby. It's called A Summoning of Souls, and it just came out from Kensington.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your time. We are so excited. We are going to go ahead and dive in. So our first question was, what was Seneca Falls and how did those events fall into the history of the suffrage movement? I know that there were a lot of things that they started out really wanting to accomplish, and I would love for you guys to talk about some of the goals. And then, honestly, Seneca Falls was where we first saw that they weren't going to achieve universal suffrage, if you guys don't mind talking about where they kind of fell apart. Dr. Walker, if you don't mind starting us.
Sure. Well, the most important thing to understand about the roots of the suffrage movement is that it grew out of the anti-slavery movement. And an awful lot of white and black women were already advocating for a greater voice for women in society, and some had even talked about the right to vote even before Seneca Falls. And Seneca Falls happened in 1848 in a small town in western New York State, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met again after not having seen each other for about 10 years. They were both anti-slavery activists, and they had met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, where women were denied the right to participate in the proceedings. And that sparked a conversation with them about injustices in the lives of women. And they said, someday we'll organize a women's rights convention. And when they came back together at Seneca Falls in 1848, by this time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was 32 years old and the mother of young children, and feeling very frustrated about her life. And they organized this convention, which took place over 2 days, and it attracted several hundred people, many of them people coming out of the anti-slavery or the they didn't call it prohibition at this point, but the prohibition movement. And there were a number of men there, the most prominent of which and the most outspoken of which was the anti-slavery advocate Frederick Douglass.
Dr. Richardson, I know that you might see things from a different perspective. Do you have any thoughts on the Seneca Falls Convention?
No, I was going to mention Frederick Douglass, and he was the only African American who was in attendance. So there were no African American women there. It was just him, and he actually was an outspoken advocate for women's suffrage at the time, which is interesting when we come into a little bit later, when we start talking about the split later. But I won't come into that yet.
And Jan, do you have any thoughts about these early days when the suffrage movement was just getting started?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, I feel like I came to this topic, in sort of like working on an exhibit that we produced recently about it. So I'm not an expert or a scholar necessarily, but one thing that I've been hearing a lot from historians more recently is the idea that Seneca Falls is like sort of a myth. The idea that, you saw women's suffrage happening before then, and it does, like Dr. Walker was saying, come out of sort of the abolitionist movement, or like people who were raised in the Quaker tradition. But that it's really Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony who ultimately write a history of women's suffrage that they publish later in the 1800s, and they create this sort of origin story for the movement that they ground in Seneca Falls, even though there were things that were happening before then. And I would love to hear, really what Dr. Walker has to say about that. I feel like that's sort of like a new conversation among historians now.
Well, I think that's a really fair reading. It was certainly the first big gathering that focused on women's rights and issued a sort of a coherent statement, this Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which was a whole list of demands to improve women's lives. But there were a lot of women who were talking about the elective franchise before this. One of the most prominent was the African American novelist Frances Harper, who was talking about suffrage even I think as early as the 1830s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that is a crazy thought, and I think that brings us to what we want to talk about next, which is as time has gone on, we've romanticized the term suffragette, but originally it was used by detractors of the women's suffrage movement to diminish them, and specifically a London newspaper in 1906 coined the term. But it has lived on while things like the 1906 articles have all disappeared and faded into history. Do you guys mind giving me your viewpoints on how you guys interpret or how you feel like the term suffrage or suffragette versus the term suffrage is being used? Jan, I'm actually going to ask you, since I know you did just do an exhibit, and I know you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, so quick question back to you. Do you mean the way that people think of it today, or the way that people thought of it sort of at the time it was being sort of like used or introduced in the early 1900s?
I know when I was, growing up, I only thought suffragette was the term. I had never heard of suffragist. And it may stem back into Mary Poppins with the song Sister Suffragette. We all know that song growing up. So the kind of, the newspapers and the detractors deemed suffragette as, oh, that little suffragette. But they wanted to be called suffragists, from my understanding. Kind of what your thoughts are between the two, and growing up, the suffragette term is maybe what has stuck around.
In my experience, I mean, I think that sort of coming to it, more recently, I don't know that I really understood the difference either between the distinct difference between suffragette being a term that sort of started in England and was meant to sort of portray a militant sort of action associated with their advocacy for their cause, versus suffragist, which is somebody who's advocating for rights. And my guess would be that a lot of people today conflate those terms. I don't think that we're sort of out of the mix and thinking that it's the same thing. Maybe it's just people pronouncing it differently. But I don't know that I think that people today think of suffragette as a negative connotation in the way that they probably did at the time. I thought a lot about this when you were talking about the questions we might talk about today. Thinking about what was negative about the term suffragette in the time period. And if we look back at the actions those people took as protesters who were, very passionate about a cause, would we think of them as extraordinary, in the context of modern protests? And I don't know. I mean, there was certainly violence. I think I associate the term suffragette specifically with British women who underwent hunger strikes, you know, and sort of under the Cat and Mouse Act were released and then put back in prison and force fed. So people who were really, you know, suffering for the cause a lot. So I don't know. I'm not sure how people today think about the terms, you know, very separately, but I'd be interested to hear, you know, what the other folks have to say about it.
I mean, I do know, like, I come from the same background Alison did, where the first time I ever heard the term was Mary Poppins.
Right.
Ladies, do you guys have any other thoughts about the more historical, like, if you didn't learn about it in a sing-along with Mary Poppins, any other viewpoints on it?
I have some interesting thoughts on that because I'm thinking about the term, the ETCE being put on there, meaning smaller or less than, or, you know, and then smaller and less than becoming synonymous with womanly. And so I do, we kind of have a historical thing where we take terms that have been given to us and we try to turn them around to kind of empower ourselves. And so I do like that it is associated with women who were like John Lewis said, making good trouble. However, I think sometimes we have to be careful with accepting terms that were given to us, especially if that's not what we want it to be called from the outset. So, for instance, there's a quote that Wade Noble said that power is the ability to create our own version of reality and then to have others respond to that reality as if it's their own. So then once you then take a term that somebody else created for you, you're not really creating your own framework, you're fitting inside of theirs. And then what's happening with the power around your movement? So.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I do think that that's a part of it. Like, they did turn around and make it their own, but it would have been great if, you know, we'd all been on board in the beginning.
Right, if you want to be a suffragist, then be a suffragist and don't take on their term, right? But then you also see that in terms of, you know, the acting industry, we no longer say, you know, if you listen to most people when they are talking about themselves, they'll say, I'm an actor. Women will say, I'm an actor. They will not say actress as much anymore. And it's kind of saying that, you know, there isn't a difference between those terms. Like, I show up and I do, you know, just as good work. And so you're not going to kind of diminish what that might be by giving it a slightly different turn on the name. So.
That's really relevant, and that's really fantastic. So one of the things that we are looking at in history itself, like the late 1800s, the early 1900s were crazy. There were inventions. There were, as you said, like the prohibition movement was getting started. We were going through all of these social reforms. So how do you guys think that the things that were going on at the time were affected by the suffrage movement? And Leanna, I am actually going to ask you first what you were thinking, like what you thought about just everything that was the early 1900s.
Well, in the middle of the 19th century, you have the rise of the Spiritualist Movement, which is happening very concurrently with the rise and the interest in the suffrage movement. And the Spiritualist Movement was looking at massive death that was happening in the 19th century. And it was also looking at lots of ways in which we were, as a society, as a global community, were questioning God and looking for new ways to look at religion and spirituality. And so in the 1840s, also in upstate New York, so there's a lot of interesting things happening specifically in New York at that time. The Fox sisters, who came from a radical Quaker family, started this interest in spiritualism, saying that they could speak with spirits. And they were later discounted through their life, but because they were women in a Quaker family, and the Quaker tradition was looking at not only abolition, and active in abolishing slavery, but also treating women as equals and educating them as equals. The Fox sisters putting out this idea of women being able to talk to spirits, regardless of whether or not they were really able to, it set a fire into the radical communities of Christians and other sort of denominations that were looking for new ways, also for women to be involved in the church, because all other churches were not letting women be clergy. So the spiritualist movement was tapping into a need for women to have a place to have something to say. And so women weren't really allowed to speak in public in the 19th century. The spiritualism movement changed that. And so women were expressing their experiences. Did a lot of women come into this and use spiritualism as a gateway just to have a public platform? Absolutely, many did. One of them being Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president in 1872 with the aforementioned Frederick Douglass as her running mate. So spiritualism is such an interesting, it's honestly, it goes parallel to all of suffrage, and there were a lot of universal suffrage, proponents of universal suffrage who were in the spiritualist movement. So while suffrage did really fall short in its goals for universal suffrage, there were a lot of people in the spiritualist movement who were trying to bring the aspects together because it was born out of this original radical Quaker idea of equality.
Wow, it's, to be honest, it is mind-blowing to hear the idea that it was a radical Quaker idea for equality. It's accurate, like that's where roots were started, but what an amazing insight was being completely different just on how to think about like what could have happened.
Well, and I think it gets discounted because people were, the Fox sisters were revealed to be like making a lot of it up. I think there were legitimate psychics and legitimate spiritualists communicating with the beyond. I do think that, but they were really looking at it much more like a modern grief counselor and doing it behind the scenes. And so it was really something that was looked at as sort of women's work. And then the way in which it was more done as a celebrity was more for like male magicians who would go and do stage tricks with it. So I think the reason why it was never embraced as a direct sort of causality alongside of the suffrage movement is because it was equated with a lot of quacks and a lot of opportunists. However, if this is the way that you're going to get a public platform as a woman, wouldn't you want to have a place to have something to say? Absolutely. So for me, whether people were legitimate in their claims to speak with the beyond, or if they were just like Victoria Woodhull looking for an opportunity to have a bit of celebrity by which she could advance a radical idea. Okay, I mean, can you fault them for that? So,
No, that's totally brilliant. Ladies, anybody else have any thoughts about, like we said, there were so many radical ideas out there in the world at the time. Can you all think of any others that might have affected the movement or should have affected the movement and made it grow beyond the scope that they wound up living in?
Well, and I would love to hear what other folks have to say, but I mean, like jumping back to Seneca Falls just for a minute, I mean, suffrage wasn't the only thing, right, that they're discussing at that convention. They're talking about women's rights generally, because at the time, women, married women couldn't own property. Married women wouldn't get custodial rights over their children. They were interested in rights to, like access to more education, better education. So there's a lot of different issues that are concerning to women. And from what I read, the suffrage question was really the only thing that kind of divided the group that were there, because a lot of them felt that it was too radical, that that was the only thing they couldn't really come to a unanimous vote on when they're, sort of signing their name to the Declaration of Sentiments. So, I mean, women had lots on their minds, and I think that a lot of them were small changes, that they felt like would give them greater control over their lives at the time. And voting was certainly one of them. But I think it was more aspirational than some of the others that they hoped to achieve, and that many middle-class white women do achieve, in the lead up to the 19th Amendment.
I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy to think about this time period being a time where a woman couldn't own anything of her own, like she couldn't have a house or a bank account or security. That whole idea is just mind-boggling to me, being that it's not even something that's existed in my generation. Like, I've always been lucky enough that I can write a check and pay my own bills and put a roof over my own head, which has been amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that kind of brings us to another thought, which was, when it comes to what we've learned about when it comes to suffrage, we've learned about Susan B. Anthony, we've learned about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Those are the women we were taught as the face of the movement. But we already know from just learning and being better about educating ourselves, that these women were just the tip of the iceberg. There were so many others that were involved. There were women, there were men, there were tons of advocates who were a part of this movement that history hasn't been as good about remembering. Can you guys think of anyone in particular that you really want to tell our audience about?
Yes. Well, was somebody else speaking?
No, I was going to say, I wonder what Omi has to say.
So, yes, I want to point out that there were Indigenous women, there were Latinx women, there were Asian women who are all active and doing things for the movement, and also active in getting their own community together and participating. But I also kind of want to put, going back to what Jan just said, it makes sense in terms of some of the women saying this is way too radical, because when you've been living inside of this framework for so long, somebody coming up and saying you can actually do this is kind of like, but can I, right? And so we're thinking about what's going on at that time. And yes, women were fighting against so many different rights, but I also want to make it kind of clear that there was still a lot of privilege inside of the movement, and when it came to white women, because they were still a very much protected class, right? Because if you even go back to Sojourner Truth, when she's talking about her in her Ain't I a Woman speech, she's saying, this man says that women should be helped into carriages and women should be protected, and she's like, no one has ever done that for me. I was down here with the men doing everything that they're doing, and Ain't I a Woman? So she's even just talking about, if you're looking at the suffrage movement, and if you're looking at the parallel abolitionist movement that's happening at the same time, Black women were falling into the margins because they were mainly focusing on Black men getting their rights. We look at the 15th Amendment. And then they were mainly focused on white women getting this right to vote, and Black women were kind of like in the margin. But at the same time, they're fighting Jim Crow, they're fighting lynching, they're fighting this was a fundamental human rights issue for Black women. And they were fighting on all sides, which kind of made them fall into the margins when laws started to become enacted. And so we're looking at Sojourner Truth, who was a part of the movement, and she actually connected with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And also, you mentioned earlier, Frances Helen Watkins Harper. Both of them actually spoke out against the racism that they saw happening in the larger women's movement. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper actually called them out while she was speaking at the convention. You had Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Shad Carey, Mary Church Tyrell, even Harriet Tubman was an avid supporter. She wasn't necessarily out in the front of the movement, but she went around doing speeches talking about her experiences being enslaved and a woman, and being a woman who's leading people to freedom by herself. So you had all these different people, and the list goes on and on. I can list probably about 20 names going in right now of people who are not named. And it was because, so for instance, even if we talk about Ida B. Wells, who, she's coming around, what year? I have so many years in my head right now. If you look at the Alpha Suffrage Club that she created, and they were looking at literacy and educating Black women about civics and advocating for the election of Black politicians, she tried to go and be a part of the march, the parade in 1913, and they were sent to the back. And so she goes to the side and waits with, a couple of other women who were sympathetic to her cause. And as the parade was coming, they go and step in the front, which is a big thing. Right, but it's understandable, because during this time, there was only so much that that these white women that were in front could really speak out against, and they're thinking about, we're trying to get universal suffrage for everybody, but what can we really fight? So there were so many different intersectional and overlapping things that were happening at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to remember that there are the women we hear about nationally, but for every one of those women, there were dozens active on the state level. Yes. And they create the real grassroots pressure that eventually influences Congress to the point that they have to take action. And I'll just tell you about a couple here in South Carolina who are really interesting. Charlotte Rollins and her sisters were all they were from a free Black family. educated in Philadelphia, but grew up mostly in South Carolina. And in the 1870s, they become very outspoken in the women's suffrage movement and in the broader movement for African American civil rights. And Charlotte Rollins becomes one of the first women to speak before the South Carolina legislature in the 1870s. And she asks them to grant women suffrage not as a special privilege or a special right, but as a human right.
Right.
And then, there were just lots of women. And so later on in the last stage of the movement, one of my favorite women in the movement is a white woman named Uli Sally, who was quite colorful and really able to, and she was a privileged middle-class woman, but she was really able to find lots of grandstanding ways to get attention for the movement. And when her husband told her that she was no longer allowed to use any of, quote, his money for the movement, she becomes the first woman to become a licensed real estate broker in South Carolina, and she uses her income that way to finance her activity in the movement. So there's, for every, Ida B. Wells or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there are dozens of women on the state level, many of whom we don't even know their names, but just now they're starting to get attention.
Right.
Well, and that brings up an amazing point about how this really is about not just developing as a nation, but also how we started off at the state, like at that local level, like the women who were your neighbors or your friends at the time were the ones who were going to revolutionize America and have this incredible national impact, which honestly, I think we see a little bit of it now, but we don't see enough of it now to really inspire the kind of change that we need. Jan, did you have any thoughts on this? I know that I'm sure there were Georgians who were involved, but
I wish I knew more about some of the people who played a role sort of on the ground, especially in the colored women's clubs that existed, sort of in Georgia. The person that I was just going to sort of give a shout out to is Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman elected to Congress, who was originally from Montana, and that is where she served, in Congress representing. But she actually spent a good portion of her later years in Georgia. I think she owned some property here. She went on to found the Jeanette Rankin Foundation, which now gives scholarships to women, and it still exists today. But she's just so interesting to me because she is elected to office in 1916 to Congress. So before the 19th Amendment, when women in her own state had recently gotten the vote, and they helped to elect her. And then she casts a vote against entering World War I, and that sort of tanks her, and she leaves Congress. And then she goes back in 1940, just in time to vote against entering into World War II. So she's just this really interesting figure. She was a pacifist and, stuck to her guns the whole time. But she lived to be 90 years old. And when she was in her 80s, she was leading anti-Vietnam War protests on the UGA campus. So I think part of the thing that strikes me about her is the idea, seeing the trajectory of these women who are around for the discussion of women getting the vote, who live long enough that you see what they're like in the rest of the 20th century is amazing to me. And I don't know what it would be like to live through that period where you're advocating to get your vote and you get it, and then you see what happens, and you start to see women elected to office. So she's fascinating to me for lots of reasons. So I'll just give her a shout out. She's not lesser known. I mean, people know her name because she was elected to Congress, but she's a really interesting figure.
No, I think that's amazing. It actually brings me to where I wanted to go next, so thank you guys. So I know that we've drilled a little bit on the fact that the suffrage movement had problems, including racial equality, but the leaders of the movement overall thought that universal suffrage would be so commonplace that it would be completely unproblematic for American culture. We would just as a society get to where it made sense that everyone should be able to vote. But then we had the anti-feminist movements that started, and I don't know if you guys caught it, it was on Hulu, but they actually kind of did a sensationalized TV version of one of the anti-feminist movements from in their show, Mrs. America.
Yeah.
How do you guys feel like like we've progressed? Have we culturally achieved the idea of universal suffrage? Are we still struggling with it as a society today? And have those anti-feminist movements actually hurt the idea of women being elected officials and being voices in their communities and a power within society?
Oh man. I don't want to be the one that starts. I will say I'm obsessed with the show Mrs. America. I just watched it recently, and the thing that strikes me most about it is that it is sensationalized, right? It's a fictional sort of version of history, but it does show, I think, the cracks within the larger movement to sort of pass the ERA, which I think in many ways mirrors the things that you see in the suffrage movement. That like not every woman is there. They're all surrounded around a common cause, but they're there for different reasons. They have different interests and they disagree with each other and what should be at the forefront of what they're talking about. So I know at the end we're going to say like what we recommend. I recommend watching it just because I think it's a really interesting look at a later time period where women are still sort of fighting for their rights. Because fighting for, I mean, you know, the discussion about birth control was also there in sort of the earlier part of the suffrage movement, but it was also considered too extreme. And so as the movement becomes more conservative, those people sort of are not, you know, at the forefront of it anymore. But I would like to hear what other folks have to say in terms of like response to your question.
Well, I don't think we have universal suffrage by any means. We just don't. We don't restrict it. We don't say that we're restricted it on the basis of sex or race, but there are all kinds of ways that we have disenfranchised people in this country. And you know, I could go on and on about the ways we're doing that even now with the objection to mail-in ballots and stripping convicted felons of the right to vote even after they have served their terms. And there are just a million ways that we are not, we are trying, that some elements of our political system are trying to restrict the right to vote. And then that has a cascading effect into every other part of public policy.
I totally agree with that. That's the same thing that I was going to say, because we're still experiencing disenfranchisement when it comes to voting. Even looking at just recently, we had so many different polling places that were closed and people didn't know that they were moved, and people were standing in line for hours here in Georgia. And I was fortunate to not have that experience when I went to my polling place. It was quick and easy, but so many people had to. I had one friend who, when she showed up to vote, they told her, "You already mailed in a ballot," and she said, "No, I didn't." So then she stood there for like 3 hours waiting for them to call different offices so that she could vote. So we still have those things going on. And then I think we also need to look at the question of why do we still have why did it just jump out of my head? College.
The Electoral College?
Yes, thank you. Electoral College. Why do we still have that? Why can we not go to use the popular vote? So I think, you know, something that was created and based in racism at the time and being able to give enough votes to the South, why do we still have that?
I learned recently that, I learned it just a couple of days ago actually, that it wasn't law that you had to provide everyone the rules or ballots in their own language. So it's like if you didn't know or couldn't read English, you couldn't vote because you couldn't read the ballot. Right. And I was like, wait, what? I live in New York City, so, you know, it's every single language imaginable. But then you also have those different types of voting changes within the different states of what is required to vote. Because in New York City, when you go to vote, you just sign your name. You do not have to show a form of photo identification. They match your signature to your voter registration. And in a lot of other states, they require very specific voter IDs and driver's licenses and things like that, which, you know, comes down to a type of voter suppression if one is not able to obtain that.
And that becomes a poll tax. So all of these things, all of the ways in which there are these hoops that the states that want all of this documentation, that's meant to disenfranchise people. And it is, in fact, truly, effectively a poll tax, which is supposed to be unconstitutional, and yet. So, and again, you also see a lot of disenfranchisement, and that's definitely recently with cities versus rural areas too. So the idea of like, cities having a more diverse population. You definitely see that there's a lot of things that have targeted cities, also being in New York City, seeing that, mailboxes have been taken away from places in New York, and other city buildings too. These things are all a part of this greater ongoing discussion that we have to have with the ways in which disenfranchisement started from Seneca Falls onwards, and we're still trying to untangle it.
Right, and many of this is roots in the 13th Amendment, with which, became, where imprisonment became the new enslavement. So, you have to stand in front of a jury of your peers, and it wasn't your peers that you were standing in front of. So if you were then convicted, now you were back in enslavement, and now you don't have these rights to vote, and all these other things that are happening. And so it's, just kind of cascading things that we are still dealing with today.
And I also think it's important to remember that, and this is to backtrack a little bit, 1920 didn't give all women the right to vote. It gave white women the right to vote. Native American women didn't have the right to vote. African American women didn't have the right to vote. Women who had married immigrants who were not citizens and had then lost their own citizenship, lost their right to vote. So you can't even say that all women got the right to vote in 1920. There's a lot more fighting.
There was a big group of Asian American women who were part of the suffrage movement and couldn't even become citizens until a couple of decades later, with the Chinese, I don't know the specifics, the Chinese. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
No, it's been such a crazy time, and I know that 2020 is such a vitally important election year. I would love to have you guys give what advice you think that women should learn from the suffrage movement. What can women today learn, and what should we be holding on to inspire us to continue to be a part of the process and to work on untangling and resolving so many of these issues that we've just kind of had to live with. Dr. Walker, if you don't mind starting us off.
Wow, that's a big question. I guess one thing, I will just say one thing, that one of the things we need to do is learn from the mistakes of the suffrage movement, from the ways that women divided themselves and allowed themselves to be divided by other political forces, and also the ways in which the movement lost momentum. They got to get an amendment and they assume the fight is over. Not everybody does. Alice Paul fights for an equal rights amendment until the day she dies. But just this assumption that now we can rest, and when there's a lesson that you really can't rest.
Exactly. I agree with that 100%. That's the same thing that I was going to say in terms of we can learn what not to do. We can learn to make sure that we are how to organize and consider the needs of everyone rather than kind of furthering certain agenda and taking care of, this lane, but leaving this lane open, and not allowing division in the movement. And just looking at the things that we still have to fight for, the fact that we're now looking at women's rights in terms of abortion, and also women are still making a percentage of the dollar, to the dollar that men make. These are fights that we still need to win, and I mean, even thinking of that when I'm working at a women's college, right? So I'm still thinking about the fact that, there are male professors who are there,
No, but that's a really good point. Like, the fight's not over yet, and we do need to keep fighting. We need to be together and work with solidity to honestly look at some of the flaws that we are still carrying forward. Like, I mean, the idea that you don't have control over your own body enough to make a decision that might be life-saving, might be important, like abortion. It's mind-boggling. I know I've had to explain to others, and they're like, what do you mean you can't make that call? Jan, did you have any thoughts on this? I know it's always a tough spot to inspire another generation of voters, but 2020.
One thing we hear a lot now is that no matter what's happening, on a federal level, you can always make an impact in your local government or your state government. And I think an issue like this really drives that home, because the battle for suffrage was really won in states before it became, something that the 19th Amendment that was passed by Congress. And I think that's important to remember that like your activity on a local level is significant. The other thing I'll say is that the League of Women Voters is an organization that's also started in 1920 by Carrie Chapman Catt. And that was her looking forward and saying this 19th Amendment thing is going to be on the books, and we need to educate women on how to sort of be good voters. How can we make sure that they know about the issues? So I think looking at that next step, like once you achieve something, what's the next step? Like what keeps you going after that? Not ignoring that there are battles in the future to fight, but making sure that you're finding ways to stay engaged with the community that you've built and to sort of keep learning the things that you need for the next challenge that's in front of you.
No, I think this is all great advice, and I'm hoping that everyone in our audience is listening, and we will take that forward with them, not just in this election, but the election immediately afterwards, which is going to be more of a local and state election.
Well, and I definitely want to just take a moment to add to the fact that we're still working towards universal suffrage. So like honestly, we're still working towards that. One of the reasons why I don't tend to use the term suffragist much in my books, I mean, my books are set in the late 19th century, so the cause is still being formulated, but I only use the term if the word universal is with it, because I want my readers to be clear that these were women and men and their allies that were like universal for everybody. And so I think that the key to making progress is intersectionality and listening. And you have to be listening to the voices who are being intentionally left out of the conversation and not trying to put your voice to the front if the people who are being hurt more disproportionately are not being at the forefront of that, then there's an automatic flaw in your movement.
Right.
No, that's brilliant. So I'm going to take us back to something that we touched on towards the beginning of the panel, which was especially in the UK, we saw a lot of kind of crazy things happening to the suffragists, like the cat and mouse being released and recaptured. So I was hoping that you guys could talk a little bit about what kind of tactics were being used against the advocates for universal suffrage or women's suffrage, either politically, at rallies, in jails. And as we know, a lot of these women were going out and they weren't necessarily supported by their spouse or family. So what kind of things do we see the suffragists fighting against, even in their own homes? I'm hoping that one of you guys can talk about the Night of Terrors, which happened in 1917. When I was doing research, it was a crazy thing to find out that this even happened in a relatively modern society. Melissa, do you mind getting us started? I know it's a big question.
Well, I think a lot of the opposition that you see happens once Alice Paul and her congressional union begin the practice of picketing the White House. And they are really calling the president out very directly. They're calling his party out very directly. They're holding up signs that compare President Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm, the tyrannical German leader we were at war with. And so that begins this process of these women being, in some cases, attacked in the streets by bystanders, and then they start to be arrested, and some of them are thrown in jail. And we know that some of them, led by Alice Paul, begin a hunger strike and they're force fed. But I believe the Night of Terrors was a particular night in which a lot of those women who were being held in jail were attacked by the guards, physically attacked. Some of them handcuffed with their hands up over their heads and to the cells so that they had to hang there all night. And it was such shocking behavior once it became public, because these were women, and in many cases, middle-class white women who were supposed to be protected from all of this. And they were being beaten in jail as a result of their protests.
I mean, it's such a crazy thing to see. Like right now, we have people who are using their freedom to protest, and you see atrocities being committed against them and against the free press, and it's a little bit shocking to be like, oh, this has been happening since we first tried to get women's suffrage. Like we have been fighting against the same form of kind of, to quote my grandmother, dirty pool, um, being held to keep us back or keep us from progressing, and it's always a little bit shocking. Ladies, did anybody else have any thoughts on some of the stuff that had happened in those early days, or even now, like with so much, there's so many people trying to be heard, and how they're keeping voices quiet?
Just even in terms of voter disenfranchisement, as Melissa was saying earlier, that everybody wasn't given the right to vote in 1920. So you had this fight going, till 1865, for which came with the Civil Rights Act, that where people were being killed. They talked, when I was doing the research, I saw that in Colfax, there were 100 plus whites who were killed. I mean, blacks who were killed by white men who didn't want them to be able to vote. You had literacy tests. You had them switching things up to where that's when we had the come in where you have to have the ballot where no one else can see or help you. So that way, if I can read and you can't, I can't help you. So if you can't read, you can't. And then as Alison was saying, it's not offered in different languages. So if you can't read that, then you can't, vote. We have poll taxes, those registration practices. And again, we see all of that redistricting happening now. We see they're trying to defund the United States Postal Service right now. This has been an interesting summer in terms of movements in general, because, one fight, they're talking about these multiple pandemics that we're dealing with. The fight that we've been dealing with is the treatment of police, of people of color, and how we don't have the same protections, and we never have. I see those lights come up behind me and I have a physical PTSD reaction. And, just even the fight where we can't even get everybody on the same page, it kind of reminds me of the division that was happening in the movement in the back. We can't even say Black Lives Matter without other people saying all lives matter, but that's always indicated, and so, people are being shut down in those ways. Even the reports of all of the different, like people looting and things like that, now they're showing proof that it wasn't the protesters who started the riots and who were looting and who were doing all these other things. So it's just, it's always like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. We're still dealing with a lot of the things that we were dealing with back then. So, it's just kind of, that piece of it was what is emotional.
It's madness. So we are coming on the end of our time, and I do want to end this with, to be honest, a personal question, one of my favorites. And Sharon Owens wrote a poem that started with, "Someone clever once said, women were not allowed pockets in case they carried leaflets to spread sedition." So I know that we, even now, like modern women's clothing, may not have pockets, or may have pockets that are too small to hold modern essentials. Ladies, what do you guys think about how women's fashion changed during the fight for suffrage, and how the suffrage movement inspired different fashion trends and different looks? And Jan, I am going to throw this to you first, because I know that you did a really great exhibit that showcased some of these things.
Well, what I was going to say, I was actually just reading today, like thinking about this panel. I never knew where the term bloomers came from before, but I was reading about how it was a friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton who basically wore sort of like a culotte pant, that was tapered at the ankle for the first time. And she wore it in New York, and other people saw it. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to start wearing it too, because women who were interested in these freedoms and equality wanted to cast off, a lot of these like sort of contraptions that they were wearing at the time. And they did, and people hated it. They got so much flack for it, and it went on for a while. But honestly, what I read said that they were so free. They loved wearing, this outfit, but they were hated on so much that they eventually returned to like the sort of conventional dress of the time period. And actually, I think suffragists started embracing that dress because they wanted to portray themselves as feminine, because they were sick of all the cartoons and these depictions that made them look masculine and made them look like they wanted to wear the pants, and they decided to just lean into femininity instead. So I don't know, you know what I mean? It's sort of like juggling these different things. Like, I think they were more comfortable in a certain way, but they made all these very conscious choices about the way they looked to make sure that they were presenting a unified front. They wore white to emphasize purity, you know what I mean? And sort of just lots of fashion choices that I don't think were about comfort. I think they were strategic, and they were to make sure that they were bringing people to their cause. Even if it was because they were staying dressed the same way. And I think that they also encouraged people to wear their finest, right? They wanted the suffragists to look their best to attract, you know, other people to the cause.
No, that's amazing. But the idea of strategic fashion is honestly like so socially appropriate. Like, you're right. Like, it's not just how you look, it's why you choose to look the way you do. Ladies, do either of y'all have any other viewpoints on pockets or strategic fashion?
Well, I
I
do
support
ask.
pockets. I'll just say that. I really support pockets a lot.
Yes, when you get a good skirt with pockets in it, it's everything, you know? Yeah. But Jan, I wanted to ask you if you're seeing if you just made me think about the parallels in watching Miss America and, you know, how each side dressed, the ones who were against ERA and those who were for ERA. It just kind of made me think of, you know, what you're talking about in terms of, you know, the early suffragists.
It's like you're wearing a uniform, right? And your cause has like a look, and sort of you're catering, to sort of like the look you're trying to portray to people. For sure. Yeah, in Miss America.
I just read an article the other day about the history of the sash and how it was something that was started with the suffrage movement of that feminine dress. We want to, you know, still be feminine, but to have everybody have that kind of that unified look. And so they created the sash with votes for women, and how it has its roots in even military garb, but almost right at when the 19th Amendment was ratified and white women got the right to vote, that almost next summer, the first Miss America pageant happened with most women wearing the sash, and how it has gone from being, you know, it went from the suffrage movement to now more pageants and bachelorette parties and things like that. And it was just a fascinating article about the history of the sash and how it's gone from one to the other. But it was a very strategic movement, strategic thing that they did, was keeping their feminine dress, but then everybody wearing the sash to show that they were for something. So it was a fascinating.
Which also has a parallel to the labor movement, because labor activists were trying to organize for, you know, the right to have safe working spaces in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. And a lot of those labor activists were working women from all kinds of different immigrant backgrounds. Jewish history is really important when you start talking about the labor movement, especially in New York, and the uprising of the 20,000 that happened in 1910. And so that also, again, they were also wearing sashes, and they were, you know, they were interested in presenting their message visually, but still being, you know, still being in their dresses, but still being out there with the message very clear on their picket signs, on their sashes. So labor organizing and the women in labor organizing was also, that was another this as well. And even if you look at the history of the bicycle, when we start talking about, I mean, for me, again, I'm focused very much in the late 19th century in my work. The bicycle was this radical thing, and women, you couldn't ride a bicycle and be in full floofy layers. So you had to sort of have a split kind of pant bloomer type thing. And there's all of these really like horrific illustrations of, you know, the craze of women bikers, and the idea of women on bicycles having a freedom to move, freedom to go places unaccompanied with their fellow lady bicyclists. And it was this sort of radical thing that I know now we can't imagine that a bicycle was radical, but for women in the 19th century it absolutely was. And there was a lot of really vilifying cartoons about it too.
Yeah, definitely. But you know, and the white, I heard the white suffrage, you know, uniforms also came from
they didn't want people to have to buy a uniform. They wanted lots of people to be able to wear something that made them look similar. So they just picked a color. And so people could show up to a rally wearing a certain color and they would look like everybody else. And I think the sashes helped in that same way. It was like a cheaper and simpler way to sort of give this unified look to people.
So, yeah, it's incredibly smart. There's so many things about the branding of the suffrage movement, you know, the colors they pick and the way that they sort of like, you know, recruit supporters. That's just so smart, especially for the time. The other thing I was going to say is that I thought so much in the last couple months. You know, we're suffering through a global pandemic, and I've been thinking a lot about 1918 when there was a global pandemic and there was a world war, and these women are still like out there for their cause because you can't just drop it, even though all these other things are happening.
Right.
So in terms of advice to people today, I mean, perseverance, like the idea that you can't let other things that are happening, you know, obscure your drive to achieve something.
No, and I think that's, I mean, one of the things we're definitely learning in this panel is that you have to keep going, you have to keep fighting. Janet, I love that advice for our audience. Would everybody else like to end with giving their words of advice for our DragonCon attendees? Melissa, do you mind any words of wisdom that you want to end our panel with?
I'll just quote Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman had this speech where I don't remember all of it, but you know, it was essentially, when times are hard, you keep going. And she had this refrain, and you keep going, and so keep going.
Yes. Omi, Leanna, would either of y'all like to leave us some words of advice?
I'll just say again, make good trouble.
That's brilliant.
I don't think there's any better words than that. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. So, yes.
Thank you.
So for our audience, if you guys want to see any more content from the alternate and historical fiction track, you can find us at alternatehistory.dragoncon.org, and that will give you links to all the other panels that we're hosting this weekend, as well as all of our social media. And remember to keep fighting, make good trouble, have pockets and skirts, and plan for strategic fashion. So thank you to all of our panelists and all of our audience for your time. This has been an amazing year and an amazing panel. Thank you guys.
Thank you.